Excellent. Well, we've had 2 months of news and short topics, but Rob, it's time for the topic.
It's time for the topic, which is the Time Meddler, Dave. We threw out 4 stories, as I mentioned at the start of this episode. The Time Meddler, The Mask of Mandragora, they were my 2 picks, and Colony in Space and Dragonfire, which were your 2 picks. And we had 191 votes. I wanted 200 votes, Dave. I'm really annoyed we didn't get 200 votes, but we got close.
We've cracked 200 once. Let's see if we can do it again one day.
Yeah, that'd be nice. And look, the final wash-up was the Time Meddler came in first with 35.1%, Mask of Mandragora with 28.8%. So two wins for me there.
Yes.
That's unusual. I've been at the bottom when we've done these more recently. Your stories, Dave, Colony in Space 20.9% and Dragonfire 15.2%, which was kind of surprising to me.
Yeah, look, I picked 2 stories I thought there was a lot to talk about, but you picked 2 stories that loved, and there's also lots to talk about, so look, that's fine. I'm happy to talk about any of them. And I've got to say the Time Meddler was quite convenient because my Australian copy of the Season 2 Blu-rays arrived a few weeks ago, and I did start a proper rewatch of all of Season 2 whilst we were doing this, and I did reach the Time Meddler a couple of days ago, so it did work out well. And I've got to say I really, really enjoyed that Season 2 rewatch. I mean, many of them are some of my favourite stories already. The Rescue, the Dalek Invasion of Earth, the Romans, the Crusade. They're all good. I enjoyed the chase. Watching the Web Planet back, I realised that I love the first half of the Web Planet, but once the Optera arrive, it all just gets a little bit silly, and then by the time you get to the end, it's really quite dull. So look, great start. Poor finish. Space Museum, I still think it's very poor, and I still think it's appallingly badly directed, but I did appreciate watching it again for the first time since 2013 is the last time I watched it. Wow. I did sort of appreciate what they were trying to do, but I don't think they succeeded. The chase is fun, but look, we're here at the Time Meddler. Rob, when's the first time you experienced the Time Meddler?
Yeah, it's interesting. I know I definitely saw this on a BBC video. So there's a line in the sand to begin with. Whether I'd seen it on UK TV back in the 90s, I may have, I probably had, but I really don't remember. Similarly, it may have been one of the black and white stories kicking around in the local fan club in the 80s, but I don't remember that either. You know, memory is weird like that. I can remember very specific things from that time, yet something like this I really have no idea about, even though there's a good chance I saw it. So for better or worse, I'll say it was a BBC video of my older brothers. So we're talking early 2000s, let's say.
Oh, wow, okay. I can certainly remember reading the Target novel. It came out in 88, and so it would have been one that I did read when I was at primary school. And I do remember it being a really interesting idea that did resonate with me. I first saw this sometime around 1992, and I can say that because the BBC repeated the Time Meddler in 1992, along with the Mind Robber and the Sea Devils, up for random reasons I don't know. And I know that the version that I saw as a bootleg copy was from that broadcast because it had the BBC idents on the start of it. So it was a broadcast version of the story. Now, it was probably 3rd or 4th generation by the time it got to me in Australia, but it wasn't DVD or Blu-ray quality, but it was better than sort of the 5th and 6th and 10th generation black and whites that were mainly what I saw of the Hartnell era back in those days. So around about 92 is the first time I saw it, which brings us now to watching it this time. Rob, what are your first thoughts? What is your overview?
I've always had a bit of a soft spot for this story. I mean, I should have mentioned reading the Target novel as well. 88 was my period of Target, so yeah, of course I read the Target novel back then.
With a really good cover that has a Time Meddler who looks nothing like Peter Butterworth.
Nothing at all. But look, yeah, I've always had a soft spot for it. I know it's a story that doesn't set a lot of people's worlds on fire. You hardly ever see people talking about it. But I think it's charming, and I think it's conceptually the series starting to reach out and bring in new concepts. The main one here, of course, the monk is a Time Lord with a TARDIS. Not that we know the term Time Lord back at that stage in the 60s, not that we know the planet Gallifrey, and even the monk refers to it as a time machine, not a TARDIS. Because I guess we're still in that phase where TARDIS was a name made up by Susan and not a name that the Doctor's people actually used. We're still in that weird sort of time, and all of that to me, is quite fascinating in a similar way that the War Games is fascinating, where we get this better look at the Doctor's people and such, but it's still not fleshed out even years after this. You know, it was a slow process that fans of the 80s, like us, grew up knowing. We already knew what happened here and what happened in War Games and in Deadly Assassin and stuff. We already knew that stuff. It was a complete thing when we came along. But for people living through this era, how amazing would it have been to get to the end of episode 3 of this story? And it's like, the monk has a TARDIS. And they go inside like, you know, stop the press. Your head would just be exploding.
Yeah, you've said a lot there.
Sorry.
No, that's
I
okay.
got carried away.
No, that's okay. That's okay. It's interesting what you said about its regard generally, because I've noticed over the last little while it's done very, very well in a lot of polls. When people do Twitter polls of different stories, it seems to do very, very well. Over at the Diddly Dum podcast, when they did their Hartnell special, where they got their listeners to all vote for their favourite Hartnells, the Time Meddler topped that poll.
Really?
It did. And
oh my God.
It's interesting. I think it's now sort of up there with the War Machines as that story that people who aren't particular fans of the Hartnell era or haven't watched all of the Hartnell era nominate as the Hartnell that they really enjoy. It's the Time Meddler and it's the War Machines, which is interesting because for me, as someone who is a big Hartnell fan and a big fan of the era, I would put it very much in the middle of the Hartnell stories. There are many, many stories that I regard far better than this. I enjoy it. It's very easy to watch. It's good. And there are many, many aspects of this that are really good, and to my mind, it raise it higher than it could have been. And we'll talk about those. But there are one or two things in there that I think are very much to its detriment and hold it back, and did mean that I thought it was a good story, but not nearly a great story.
Right. I'm really interested to hear that, though, about Diddly Dum, because the War Machines, for example, I will always go into bat for, and I think it is a bit underrated, so I'm surprised to hear that was so high as well. I just must be mixing with the wrong people, Dave, because in my world, this and the War Machines just aren't highly regarded.
I think in the UK as well, there's a very big soft spot for the Time Meddler because of that 92 repeat. So a lot of people who are our age, that might have been the only Hartnell they saw for a very long time. And it was one that they saw on broadcast. So I think it's got a bit of regard for it there as well.
Now, this, as much as I can make out, is the first pseudo-historical. Am I right in saying that?
Yes, it's the first one that brings in science fiction-y things. We'd had the Romans, which was the comedy historical.
Yes.
And then the Crusade came back and did the very straight historical. But yes, this is the first pseudo-historical.
Yeah, and we still get some real historicals after it. I mean, the Mythmakers, Massacre, Gunfighters,
the
Smugglers,
Highlanders.
Yeah, but this is the first time we're back in history where the plot revolves around something not from that era. In this case, a Time Lord trying to change history. I think that's probably a good place to start. This is a pseudo-historical. Again, the show reaching out, doing something new to me.
Yeah, it does. It's still very much a Hartnell historical because not only is it set during an actual historic event, like a lot of Hartnell stories were, but the audience is educated about that. And I think I counted 3 separate occasions where the Doctor gives a little speech about, oh, well, King Harold had to go and fight the Battle of Stamford Bridge before he did the Battle of Hastings. And that was sort of thing. And look, I can remember as a kid learning about that part of history from watching the Time Meddler and then going and learning more about it. So, you know, it did work in that sense. So it does have that real historical sort of educational thing that a lot of the Hartnell era did. But you're right, it's different because suddenly you have the wristwatch being found. You have the monks chanting and suddenly it's, oh my God, that's actually a record with the gramophone going down and all the little things. And then suddenly the monks using an electric friar and it goes from there. And it does add a whole different dimension. And you're right, for the audience at the time, they would have gone, oh, okay, this is one of those ones in the past. Oh, they're doing 1066. Oh, huh? That's different.
And look, for a modern example, I would look to something like, say, Rosa, which is full of historical things that happened, like the incident on the bus and so on. But at the same time, there's an alien running around doing alien stuff. It's in that same vein. which is a style of story that's still with us today.
Yeah, and it's a style that I think really came to dominate for quite a while and really set the template for a lot of very well-regarded, if not classic stories. I mean, stuff like The Time Warrior, Talons of Weng Chiang, Horror of Fang Rock, they're all pseudo-historicals, and they're all very well-regarded.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I talk about what holds this back for me, Rob?
Yeah, go for it.
It's the structure of the story. And there's two sort of parts to this. One is that it's very, very obvious that Hartnell has got his week's leave in part 2. Yes. And I think it was actually a mistake to have the pre-record of him banging on the door to sort of try and pretend that Hartnell was there, because all it sort of really does is highlight that he's not there. So I think that was a mistake, but it does mean that things do noticeably slow down in part 2 particularly, because Hartnell is really driving this. The other problem with the structure is, look, I agree, as you said, the cliffhanger to part 3 is one of the greats of Doctor Who history. It's a TARDIS, the monk's got a TARDIS. That is show-shattering, mind-bending. It's a really big deal. The problem is the story wants it to be the part 3 cliffhanger, which means you have 3 episodes of not getting to that point, and then a fourth of, well, now we know who the monk is and what his plot is, and we've got to stop him. And I think that, again, in part 3, I could feel the plot slowing down because we need to get to 25 minutes to have this cliffhanger. And there is a certain amount of Stephen and Vicki just wandering from the monastery back to the village and back to the monastery because, hey, we've got to fill out the time. And that means it does struggle a bit. The fourth part is excellent, when everybody's on set, everybody's on deck, and we've worked out what's going on, and it brings it all together. It's really good. I'm not saying the other 3 are bad. Part 1's really good, but I think that the structure of the story means that it noticeably slows and drags in those middle 2 episodes.
If we had Hartnell on board for the second episode, could that reveal have been at the end of the second episode?
I think that's how you would do it in hindsight, absolutely. You'd have 2 episodes of what's going on, and then 2 episodes of we know what's going on, now we've got to stop it.
It's funny you mentioned the pre-record of his dialogue too, because I was watching a Grand Tour video last night where Richard Hammond and James May were on there looking at the vehicles from the Scandi Flick special.
Oh, yes, I know the one. I've seen it, yes.
And they've got Clarkson pre-recorded as if he's trapped in the boot of his Audi.
Yes, and it's
exactly the same conceit.
It's exactly the same conceit. It's also very obvious that Hammond and May don't actually know what Clarkson has recorded, so they're just giving very generic reactions, hoping it fits his pre-record.
Yeah, I just thought I'd throw that in because I watched it last night.
Yes, no, I have seen it. That's very funny. Rob, I've talked about what I thought about the pacing. Do you agree? And what did you like about it?
About the pacing or the episode?
The episode. I'm trying to segue into a good point.
Well, look, I want to talk about the elephant in the room. I want to talk about the monk.
Okay.
Because the monk makes this interesting to me because he's not a, I'm evil kind of guy, He's not like that in the slightest. He'd just like to tweak some history, Dave, and tweak it in probably a positive way, or what he at least feels will be positive. He thinks Harold will be a good long-term ruler. And he already talks about changing history anyway already. He's helped make Stonehenge and things like that, which is something I think modern people quite enjoy going to visit. So was that necessarily a bad thing? Look, I know it goes against the rules of the Time Lords and the Doctor gets really aggro about it. But the situation isn't, this guy wants to mess everyone up or this guy wants to rule the world. He just wants to tweak some stuff and have some fun. I find that really interesting, and I actually find it a more realistic motivation than half the stuff the Master ever does, for example. The Master's always doing this really weird stuff, and when you stop and think, you think to yourself, is that really a motivation? This to me is much more of a motivation. If you had a time machine, would you not be tempted to go back and just tweak something, Dave?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'll say right at the top, Peter Butterworth's performance is absolutely one of the things I mentioned earlier as being a thing in the story that elevates it. And even when the story is dragging a bit, as I identified, his performance keeps you involved. And it's really, really good. It's really light of touch. It's subtle is the wrong word. I think subtle is an overused word, but it is light of touch. And it's fun because of that.
Well, I've got some thoughts on that too, but go on.
But yeah, look, it's interesting as well. He's explicitly identified as not being a contemporary of the Doctor's and of being somebody who's about 50 years behind the Doctor, which I think is interesting, and a real contrast to what would come later, where the Master was at school with the Doctor, the Radi's the same age as the Doctor, Drax was at college with the Doctor, like they were all contemporaries, whereas the Monk is explicitly someone who's come a bit later. And of course, we're not contrasting the Monk with the Master, because the Master hasn't been invented yet for the audiences watching this as it goes out. The contrast is with the Doctor, and this is the Doctor who has had those big dramas in the Aztecs about you can't change history, and he's lectured people about how you can't interfere with Napoleon's plans in the Reign of Terror. So it is actually a contrast to the Doctor that we're seeing here. And you're right, he's just having fun. That's an interesting motivation, but it is very, very clearly said as well that his morals are very, very dubious, and he's very happy to blow up thousands of Vikings just for a laugh. So there is a very wicked aspect to him.
There is, but the benefits of blowing up those Vikings, that would seem like a small price to pay for what he may cause to happen, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, look, I do see what you mean, and the story sort of moves around that in a very light manner as well. I think it's explicitly stated by Stephen there to just give a little bit of menace to the character and just make sure we know that the stakes are a little bit higher than they might otherwise have been, particularly given that Butterworth is playing him in such a lovable sort of manner. We need to just be reminded that, okay, look, I know this guy's a bit of fun and he's lovable, and hey, it's Peter Butterworth, but, he's also a mass murderer, so, let's not love him too much.
Now, I said I had thoughts on Peter Butterworth, so let me get to those before we move off the topic. Peter Butterworth himself, removed from the character of the Monk, is really interesting, as when you read people's thoughts on this story, they go on and on about him like he's some sort of scenery-chewing carry-on character. And he's really not. Like, the character is really fun to watch and a bit quirky and interesting. You described it as a light touch, I think, a moment ago. I never find him particularly over the top or weird, yet that's often how he's written up.
Yeah.
And that's something I don't understand. It's like, did the people actually watch this story, or is that just received fan wisdom or something?
Yeah, and it's also interesting. A lot of people who wrote a lot of that received fan wisdom have obviously grown up with Peter Butterworth in Carry On films and a whole lot of other stuff. And so they know who he is. Whereas, look, when I saw the Time Meddler, I'd never heard of Peter Butterworth. I'd never seen anything that Peter Butterworth had also been in. I think the only other thing that I've ever seen him in was a very bad sitcom with John Ingman, when John Ingman sort of walked away from Are You Being Served for a year, and he and Peter Butterworth did this really terrible sitcom where Ingman's character inherits a rock factory in Brighton or something, and the sort of the running catchphrase is "How's your rock cock?" And that's about the depth of the humour.
Wow.
Yeah, and yeah. I think from memory, Peter Butterworth plays the sort of the factory shop steward. The guy who I've got a new owner, but I'm the guy who has to run the factory or something, and it's not great.
Right.
It's what John Inman was doing when what's her name was Mrs. Slocum was doing Come Back Mrs. Noah, and it's about as good.
Okay, let's rule a line under that one.
Yeah, but the point is, I think if you're not part of that generation of English fans, you don't bring anything to this about who Peter Butterworth is. He's just the actor playing the Monk.
Yeah. And I don't think he does it in an over-the-top way. I think he's really quite believable in this role.
Yeah, he is. And he's also got some funny lines, but there's also some really quite... Again, dark's too strong and overused a word, but the moment when he sends the Vikings down a blind alley, knowing that by the time they get back to where he was, the villagers will have caught up with them, so they can kill the Vikings while he gets away. It's subtly done, but it's very, very okay, he knew what he was doing there.
Oh, of course. But look, even scenes like where he just wants to get on with his plans, and you've got villagers with a hurt villager saying, "Oh, can we bring this hurt guy in?" And he's like, "Oh, yeah, of course." You can just see his exasperation.
Yes.
He just wants to get on with having fun.
Yes, and look, the final point I'll make there is I like that the thing that really makes his plan come unstuck isn't so much anything the Doctor does, although the Doctor gives him his comeuppance at the end after the events. It's the fact that he's like all these local villagers, these local primitives, they're too stupid to know that, I'm lying to them, but they're not, and they absolutely work out what his plan is and what he's up to, and they're the ones that go and ruin it for him. So I like that arrogance bringing him down.
Yeah, very, very much so. Dave, this is our first proper Stephen story where he's a companion, and what a great intro, just staggering into shot with his beard. I love the bearded Stephen look, Dave. and his toy panda, his disbelief that the TARDIS is a time machine is a bit laboured at times, but it's understandable when he's wandering around 1066 and then finding things like a wristwatch. You can almost understand his confusion. Although the mere fact he's no longer on Mechanus must show him that, this crazy box has taken him somewhere, quite magically. But look, I quite like Stephen, so of course I'm going to be all over this being his first adventure. How about you?
Yeah, I think he's really good. It's interesting to me that this is only the second time in the show's history that we've had a companion introduced. And Vicki got an entire two-parter in which to do that. Stephen gets basically the back end of episode 6 of The Chase, and then, as you say, there's a good 5 to 10 minutes of them in the TARDIS actually taking the time, and then all of episode 1 really is just about introducing Stephen to the viewer and introducing Stephen to the TARDIS. And there is lots of, this is what we do, and this is how it works, and it is just so much more detailed and thorough than I think we'll ever get again, which was just good to show. But look, Peter Purves just commands the role to start off with. He's clearly got a good relationship with William Hartnell, and their banter and their comic timing together is really good. He clearly gets on with Maureen O'Brien, and just she enjoys having someone to sort of not argue with, but sort of cross swords with a little bit, and he's trying to sort of put her down and she's trying to put him down, and they're just finding this level of, this is I'm the experienced one here. You might be the big space adventurer, but I've been doing this a bit longer than you have, so you know your place. It's good. It's good.
Yeah, well, I mean, Vicki is well settled into the TARDIS at this point and does get to play that sort of senior companion who knows stuff and has a better read, perhaps, on how to have an adventure, especially when the Doctor's missing for much of the story. And Vicki gets to sort of take a bit of a lead, even with Stephen's big presence there.
Yeah, she does. I think that it's really good that Vicki is not diminished by Stephen coming on board, and in fact, I think Vicki actually expands a bit by Stephen coming on board, and also the fact that the TARDIS crew has now for the first time gone down to 3 rather than 4, and there is a little bit more space for all of those characters to breathe a bit more, including the Doctor. The Doctor now has a bit more space, and we are now at this point where the Doctor is very clearly the star of the show. It's not the ensemble with Ian and Barbara as almost co-leads that it was 2 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to bring up a point here. Now, I've said that a couple of things have livened what could have been a dull and dragging story. That's Butterworth's performance. That's the interesting historical and pseudo-historical take. But the third thing for me was the direction. And this is Douglas Camfield. And we sometimes forget, because Douglas Camfield is so associated with those big classics of the 70s, we sometimes forget that he was around in the 60s as well, and indeed in the Hartnell era. And his direction here is absolutely amazing, and even more so when you do pause and remember that a lot of these shots were being done as live, with the camera having to know exactly where to go, the actors moving with it, and then they'll switch. The vision mixer would switch live between camera 1 and camera 2, then back to camera 1, and then the move there, and then camera 3, and it was all being done, edited inside the camera, which is just extraordinary. There are scenes, for example, there's one where Woolnough and his friends come back into the village, and the camera starts with Edith, and then as Woolnough comes in, the camera meets him and then circles with him, so that now it's facing him with its back to Edith. And it's just the way that it all sort of works together. The way that that shot you talk about where Stephen's first seen, and it starts off on the panda and then it pulls out. And there are a number of ones that do that. There's ones, for example, where they start on the frying pan that the monk's using and then they pull out. There are others where they go back in. There are others where the camera picks up a very particular part of the scene. And this would have been all done simply by the cameraman. And it's really complicated stuff, but it works so well. And there's a real dynamism to the direction of this that contrasts with the very flat direction of the Space Museum 2 stories ago and the very that'll do direction of the Chase 1 story ago. This is actually hard to do, and Camfield does it extraordinarily well. And he would have been a young director at this point, just, proving what he could do.
Well, look, in this area, I want to mention I especially love the way they do cloudy skies and things like this. And for the life of me, I don't know how they've done it. It's too early for CSO. It's certainly not one of those giant LED screens that they put in the background of shows like The Mandalorian these days. Yeah. So how is it done? Think of Vicki and Stephen at the top of the cliff being filmed from below, and the sky above them is filled with moving clouds. It looks really good now, and for the time on a small black and white TV, I think it would have looked excellent. And I don't know how they did it.
No, you've got the staging of the shot where the monk at the end has his face in the door of his TARDIS, which would have been mixing two different shots, again done as live. And we've also got really good use of stock footage as well to make the Viking invasion actually seem like a Viking invasion.
Do you think his head in the TARDIS was mixing scenes, or was it possibly a model?
It looks to me like it's a mixed scene, because it does look like some other model shots they've had in the past, like the Daleks, for example, where they put in the model sort of behind the actors. So yeah, that's what I saw it as being. I could be wrong. If listeners know, do let us know. But not just to finish a point before, not just the stock footage that makes the Viking invasion seem like one, but stuff like just putting in a few seconds of stock footage of seagulls when they're on the beach. So we're on the beach, cut to some seagulls, cut back to the studio, just adds to that feeling that we are actually outside. And one thing that, just to expand and finish this point about the direction, is that we don't have proper music in this story. And if you look at the credits, it doesn't say composer, it just says percussionist. Because all you have is one guy with obviously a large percussion set just doing lots of sort of very tense booms and jingles. I know there's been a lot written over the years about Camfield and his relationship with composers and the like, but the best that I've been able to discover over the years seems to be that Camfield was very, very aware of how much incidental music costs. You've got to pay a composer to write the music and conduct it. You've got to pay 2, 3, 4 studio performers to perform that music, and it's a very large part of the budget. And so he has decided, clearly as far back in his career as this, that you can just cut all of that. And normally he'll go and use stock music, and he's certainly will in a number of Doctor Who's and Blake Sevens. But here he just said, no, I'm just going to pay one guy with a drum kit, and he's just going to do some background percussion to sort of lay over a few of the tenser moments. And the money he saved from doing that has clearly gone into those special effects that we've been discussing and that extra filming that we've been talking about.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I agree, because it's clearly there. There are things done in this episode that aren't done in other stories.
Correct. Point from you, Rob.
Gosh, I've got 2 directions to go here. I don't know which way to go. Okay, I'll go with this one. The term Time Meddler is interesting. The way the Doctor uses it in the story, it's like a time meddler is a thing. Not an occupation per se, but it seems that it's a term Time Lords use for people like the monk.
Yes, it's like saying, oh, so you're a Hell's Angel or you're a graffiti artist.
Yeah, which would suggest it's a big enough problem to be a thing that needs its own term. Isn't that interesting to consider?
It is, and it's a shame that the show didn't really go down that path.
Yeah, that's just something that popped out to me. Another thing, Dave, the Doctor being caged up at the end of the first episode, it ends with this look of fury on his face. And although that's obviously not written with an eye on 50 years later, I see a real through line between that and the Matt Smith episode. I think it was his first Weeping Angel story, where he does the big speech about, didn't anyone ever tell you, if there's one thing you put in a trap, it's not me. Do you remember that speech?
I know
you don't like wanky speeches.
I don't like that speech. No, it is a wanky speech, but yes,
okay.
I do remember it.
But the fury that Smith has there, I can sort of draw a line between Hartnell being annoyed at being in a trap and Smith being put in a trap and being annoyed. That was just a little observation. Yes,
and he does very quickly escape, and you also get that second time that he's put in the cell by the Vikings, and he does set a trap for the Vikings, and he gets that, I thought you were never coming back.
Yeah, that's great.
Speaking of the Vikings, I think that The other weaker aspect of this story that I will highlight is some of that supporting cast and background artists. None of them are terrible, but few of them are very good. I think the actress playing Edith is quite good, and she has some really good scenes with Hartnell particularly. The villages are very just generic villages. The Vikings are pretty rough. And I was also just thinking, if this had been done in modern television, obviously there would also be a lot more of the villages. It wouldn't just be sort of 3 or 4 of them, but the villages would probably be a lot younger. The Vikings would all be very buff and very fit 19-year-olds, rather than just a bunch of sort of middle-aged actors in bad wigs, yeah.
And of course one of them has to be called Sven.
Yes, Sven and Ulf. Yes, it's all... look, it's fine, but I contrast it with The Crusade only a few stories ago, where I think those actors playing a lot of those characters were far better, and the design was quite a bit better as well.
Yeah, well, look, behind the scenes, I think it was all changed at the BBC at this point. I believe that when this was being written, Dennis Spooner didn't even really know who would be in it. There were question marks against Jacqueline Hill and Maureen O'Brien. I think he was writing this not even knowing who his characters were going to be.
Yeah, that's probably true. And look, it is the very last story of season 2, and I suspect that the budget was running out and a lot of people were very tired, not least the regulars. So, that's fair. Do we need to talk about what some would say problematic moment in the story?
Oh, I can think of one, but I'm not sure it's the one you're thinking of.
The assault on Edith?
It is, actually,
yes.
Yeah. It seems to get glossed over.
It's interesting. When I watched this as a kid, so I would have been 12-ish when I saw this the first time on VHS, I didn't get any particular connotations from what had happened. I knew that Edith had been captured by the Vikings, and she'd probably been, tossed around a bit and assaulted a bit. Roughed up. Yeah, that's the word. Yeah. And then she's obviously, quite shocked by that, and she's hurt and all the rest of it. And I didn't see it as being anything more than that. Looking at it now with adult eyes, there are very clearly implications in there. I mean, if you talk about Vikings, people use the phrase rape and pillage, and Edith's reaction to what has happened is very, very much that sort of shock at being sexually assaulted. So I think it is there, but I didn't see it as a kid. So I think it keeps to that line just about right, but it is somewhere that only 60s Who would go. In fact, only Hartnell era Who would go. What did you think of it?
It really hit home for me most when Hartnell comes back down from the monastery, and clearly she's been, quotation marks, roughed up. And he doesn't even really sort of say, how are you, or are you okay? It's just sort of very cursory conversation, then he's off again. And that's when it really hit home to me. Like, they weren't concentrating on it. It wasn't really part of the story, but clearly it had happened. And I guess that's what you do in kids' television. You're not going to dwell too much on this sort of thing. You just leave it to the viewer's imagination, maybe. Yeah,
I think that's right. I think that whilst it does, to an adult watching it 60 years later, seem a little bit gauche and, uncomfortable that the Doctor brushes over it and that it's not really highlighted, I think you're right. It would be inappropriate for a kids show to go that further, because it is, it was being done for kids and families in the mid-60s. So I think they couldn't have gone any further. And I think there's also a part of it where they're sort of saying, this is 1066. Viking raids were common. It's not that long ago from when the Vikings had successfully conquered England, King Canute and all the rest of it. So are they saying to a certain extent, this is part of life? If you're a villager in a coastal village in the north of England in 1066, bad stuff happens.
Well, look, the world is a different place these days. I mean, a contemporary story right now in the media is cutting words like fat and ugly out of Roald Dahl books. Someone can't be fat or ugly anymore, Dave, so...
Yeah, look, that's a whole kettle of worms we won't go down. Don't get me started.
We live in a different world.
Don't get me started on Roald Dahl, because I could really lay the boot in. But we won't.
Oh, I understand that too, but I'm just saying.
Yes, no.
It's a different world.
I know the point you're making. So, yeah, look, I think that they got the balance right, given they were going to go down that path. Was it a mistake to go down that path? Look, I don't know. I'm not going to judge them 60 years later. But yes, it is something that the older I get, the more you see it.
Yeah, absolutely.
The final point I just want to make is about the conclusion of the story. Yeah. I remember, again, as a kid watching this the first time, thinking it was incredibly cool what the Doctor had done to the monk's TARDIS. I think it's one of those solutions that we think about Doctor Who as being all about, and we want Doctor Who to be about. Whenever somebody says it's a real shame the Doctor just, blew up the space station or whatever to solve the problem, what we're looking to is a solution like this, where the Doctor does something really clever. He does something that only a Time Lord could do to the monk's TARDIS, and it's a great visual. It's a great idea. If he doesn't punish the monk by hurting him or jailing him or killing him or anything like that, he just traps him on Earth and makes him suffer for a bit. And I think that's just a really cool little ending. And given that the Doctor has been absent for a lot of this story, he was obviously missing in part 2. In part 3, he sort of just wanders around a bit. But as he starts to get in there, he is the one that takes charge of the situation. He is the one that tricks the monk into explaining what's going on. And then he is the one that finally punishes the monk. And the Doctor should be the one that solves the problem in the end. And I think that's a really effective conclusion that I did like.
Yeah, very fair. And I mean, the monk doesn't deserve death. He's just doing the equivalent of like a kid going, yeah, nah, 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 nah. So the Doctor's solution of shrinking down the inside of his TARDIS is almost the equivalent of a nah, 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 back at him.
Exactly, exactly right.
So it's actually a quite appropriate kind of punishment. And it ties in nicely with the Doctor, not going around killing people if he can avoid it. Yeah, so completely agree with you there. Dave, for me, I'll finish off before we get to our conclusions on the story by just mentioning the ending of the story with everyone looking off to the stars. I mean, we talked about the Reign of Terror, many months ago now when we looked at season 1 and how that season ended. Here, it's not so much a dialogue driven, but just the three leads looking off into the stars with a bit of a sketchy TV effect on their faces.
Yeah, that blew me away the first time I saw it. I had no idea that was coming. And it is
right.
It is really, really nice. And it is just this acknowledgement. I mean, we now think of these as being seasons, but the Hartnell era particularly, and to some extent the Troughton era, do sort of feel as though they just keep rolling on because they were making 40, 50 episodes a year. Yeah. But it is nice that they do have this moment to sort of punctuate where they are, and that we've got a new TARDIS crew, which, again, we sort of think of this as just another TARDIS crew, but we only had 2 seasons of the show, and we've now got rid of 3 of the 4 regulars that we opened with. So it would have been kind of a big deal for the audience to go, well, we've got a completely different crew now.
Yeah, let's reflect on that for a moment. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, conclusions. Do you want to go first or will I?
Look, I don't really have anything new to say. I think it's a good story. I don't think it's a great story. I think that the plotting and the pacing does slow it down to its detriment, but Hartnell's performance, Butterworth's performance, Camfield's direction, and just the fun of the concept and the historical setting all make it work. They all lift it up in a way that other stories might not be. And so I enjoyed watching it. If I was doing grades, this would sort of be in the BB plus sort of area that, could do better, but a perfectly solid story.
Yeah, look, is it a great story? I'd be the first to say no, although you've said that already, so I'm probably the second to say no. Is it a bad story? Not on your life. It's really watchable. It's easy to understand. It actually sets up what the series will become in the future. It's one of those episodes. The monk's scheme is, like I said earlier, quite believable. So it might not be the Dalek invasion of Earth or the Romans, to pick 2 other stories from this season, but I think it's entertaining enough and also introduces concepts that would become more important in time, like other Time Lords out there in the universe and so on. So, yeah, I quite like this. Probably a B- for me.
That's fair enough.
And that wraps us up on the Time Meddler. I hope you enjoyed that, folks.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that was very fun to talk about. It's an underrated story in terms of its importance in the canon, I think.
In terms of the canon, absolutely.